How are you, Seth? You've been doing okay?
I've been good. I've been good. Going down the rabbit hole, as I told you. I just finished at least the video online version of book one, Belonging Again, just going through those. It seems like you're talking about each chapter, you're not like reading it, but in effect, that's probably a better way to get at it because just something about hearing a conversational speaking voice rather than like the very anyway, it's been delightful. It's there's many other things going together, but with a work like Belonging Again, of course there is for someone like me a certain learning curve to actually understand when you say Bonhoeffer, like what does that mean, or when you say various phrases, but then when you hear it enough, then you're like, oh, I'm starting to put this together. So I feel like I've come to the next sort of level of understanding the overall concept with Belonging Again, which is very helpful to me personally because I can connect it in many ways. So other things have been happening, but I couldn't help but share that with you because that's been a big piece recently.
Well, my goodness, despite all of the internet chaos and running out to this local library, so long live local libraries, that's very kind of you, and I'm honored you would go through all those different videos. And Samuel, it is a pleasure to see you, ma'am. I hope you are doing well. Seth is awesome, and awesome people should meet one another, so I'm very glad that you're both here. And no, I appreciate that very much. I did decide with the Belonging Again essays, going section by section, just to talk about them more so. And I'm glad that you find it personally relevant. The hope of the book Belonging Again is that it is articulating something that people already kind of know. I sometimes think it's funny how some of the best books you read in your life are just articulating something you already know, but maybe just not articulated, right? That it's kind of bringing an intuition into language. And that's kind of the hope of a lot of the kind of the concepts of belonging again, that you have this sort of feeling of, well, this notion of a certain destabilization, a certain idea that it is hard to place yourself in social relations because people have different horizons of what constitutes a social relation and how do you operate in that space. I think it was funny because I was part of something called the Jefferson Literary and Debating Society. It was at UVA, and they had their 200-year bicentennial this weekend. So I went up on Friday. It was very, very cool. It's the oldest literary and debating society in the country. And it was very neat as well because I would say one of the things is you have all these different people of so many political, ideological, racial, sexual, national orientation that are able to come together and have like this shared space. Oh, you were part of this, and this has been building for 200 years. And it's a debating society, but um, you see the possibility of people actually discussing ideas and disagreeing in a civil way that actually creates a feeling of belonging. Because if you know you can come together with people and talk about these topics, and actually everyone comes, I think it's funny. I think it was, and I'm happy to speak about anything at all this evening as I sit outside this public library and hope they don't kick me out. It's already closed, so I don't think they'll kick me out. But I'm absolutely down for anything on this fine evening. But there's I think it was Judge Hand who said something along the lines of the spirit of freedom, and I always connect that with the spirit of community, is found in that spirit that's not too sure of itself. That it's actually not too sure of itself. It has a little bit of uncertainty. And we tend to associate uncertainty with a bad thing. But what's so lovely is actually you see, like in a Jeff Society environment, where uncertainty is precisely the open where you care to listen to the other person. Because if you're certain, why would you even bother, right? But in fact, having that uncertainty, you say, well, maybe I don't know everything, so maybe I should be open. So Christian, good to see you, sir. I'm sitting outside a public library. I haven't been kicked out yet, so that's great. But the Jeff Society always reminds me of that. And the reason I also bring that up is because I often think about the challenge of belonging in tied to a disposition that can handle bringing people together that actually have all of these different positions, all of these dispositions, different life walks. I was at one moment I was speaking to a lawyer, the next moment I was speaking to a mechanic, the next moment I was speaking with someone who's doing environmental work, and then when he was like he's in his 90s now, then you're meeting someone who just graduated at 20. Mr. Rivera, good to see you. And how all of these people actually find a certain connection. And I would associate this with the geopadic, as Javier and Jockin and Michelle have been speaking about, and how when you see people come like that, it is a sort of glimmer of the possibility of belonging that is not just based on sharing geography or sharing an occupation or sharing ideology. It's actually truly pluralistic. And the question becomes, how do you create those conditions, et cetera, so forth, and so on and so forth. So anyway, I appreciate everything you said, but I'd be happy to speak about anything at all if anyone has any thoughts, et cetera, so forth on this fine evening.
I kind of had a topic that's been brewing in the back of my mind, and I kind of,
Fantastic.
yeah,
Fantastic.
I thought this would be like a really fruitful place to like bring it forward because I don't know, like I think the nice thing about this is that we all come with like just different angles, and I never, yeah, it like I think we are very much not a debate community, like, but I don't know. I think like for a few weeks now, I've just been thinking a lot about. I had tweeted like, "How's everybody's Greek tragedy summer going?" And it just made because I was thinking a little bit about Greek tragedies, like the idea of with an H when you the tragic flaw of like a Greek. Do you know okay, there's Greek word for it. But like this idea that like a character has like a tragic flaw, or the idea that like the sins of the father are paid for by the son. And like in Greek tragedies, these things are maybe they were functioning as sort of like didactic stories, right? Like there's lots of things that you can get from a tragedy, but I was really overcome by the idea of like fate in particular. And like design the reason I wanted to bring it here is because I didn't really know what to think about it because there does seem sometimes like one's life has a bit of like a line of fate running through it. And these things are easier to perceive. Maybe they're necessarily perceived in retrospect. Like without the technologies of storytelling, it's just like not even perceivable. But then at the same time, it's like I do really, also perceive the line of freedom running through a person's life. And where do those things intersect? Because it seems like almost like the one, though it's a paradox, the one begets the other. Like the more you cultivate your attention and towards the world so as to open yourself like to gain the skills of various concepts, various skills and affordances, so as to be a more like free individual. And like on a kind of like that works on a personal basis, but maybe also like I'm also reading the universal learning process, and just like there's a kind of ontological mandate that life has to be towards this freedom. And it seems like the more that you do that, like the more that like the order that is perceivable kind of like winks back at you. And actually, like it's not like the more free you feel, the less fated you feel. Like in my own personal experience, it's quite the opposite, where the more free you feel, the more you're like sort of fated. Like the more that what you desire, like is what you are or something. I don't know. Anyways, curious to know what you think about it.
Well, that is fantastic. There's a few things that come to mind. I'll give it to Mr. Rivera. So there's one way in which fate could be really comforting, because sometimes we go crazy wondering what choice, and if I make a bad choice, what if it ruins everything? And if you can go, well, it's fated. Oh, great. I don't have to worry about it. But then in another way, fate is terrifying. Oh, great. What's the point if it's all fated, right? There's a way in which in Christianity there can be an idea of providence. So what are differences between providence and fate? There's something about providence that can be very comforting, that God has a certain providence and that in the end all things are new. But in another way, then you're like, well, why did you bother to make humans then, God? If you could have just made all things new, what's the point of the process, right? So there's something very interesting. Also, what it seems meaningless to discuss fate unless there is something unpredictable. Like if it's the unpredictability that the word fate as this kind of X variable hangs over. It's like the unpredictability is actually already set. It's just that you can't know it ahead of time, right? And so are you going to give yourself over? And it's interesting to think, because you mentioned Brendan's work, giving yourself over to the process.
Mm.
There's something about fate in that, right? Like if there's a process, I'm giving myself over to the fate. I'm giving myself over to the process, which is actually how you find yourself. But then there's also something that seems really problematic because if you're giving yourself over to the process, what value do you add? There's also a value question. If there are things that are fated, what value do you add? Right? There's a million more things because when you bring fate into Greek tragedy, I think often about the idea, and I'll give it to Javier and Seth, on the idea that you have characters that if they do the right thing, they end up in a problematic situation. And how can they not do the right thing? That's kind of the paradox, is that, if Odysseus is trying to know the truth and he's doing how fate is very interesting because here's my bias. There's something about a game theory problem with fate, right? It's like if you're a good person, you'll do a good thing. And if the good thing gets you screwed, then you're screwed. Like how can a good person not do the good thing, right? In order to avoid your fate, you would have to do a bad thing. But isn't that bad? So how do you avoid fate then? Because there's an idea that fate in the tragedy has a negative sound, right? Like it's kind of negative in the Greek tragedy, right? Well, if the only way you avoid a bad outcome is to not do the good thing, then that means you'd have to do a bad thing. So that's a bad outcome. But then if you do the good thing, you're stuck by that logic into a bad outcome, right? And there's something about fate that seems where a character is in a situation which either way they go, they get a bad outcome. And then, of course, the question is, what is the nature of reality for such to be the case? And Mr. Jock, it is good to see you, sir. And I salute you with all of the logistical challenges. I am sitting outside a random library. So I'm going to get to Mr. Rivera and then Seth. Mr. Rivera, thank you for being here this evening, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad Sam brought this up because I've been talking to Jockin and Luber offline about good and evil versus constraints and how there seems to be a qualitative feature to good and evil concerning constraints. Now, we may disagree about what constitutes the values or behaviors that should occupy these spaces, which is, I think, perhaps always going to be the problem, or perhaps that's why we bring in beauty. But I think I would opt for Buber's distinction between fate and destiny. Because for Buber, fate is when you are running away from something. Buber is a directionality kind of argument, which is if you're running towards fate, it's destiny. Yes, Martin Buber, yeah. So if you're running towards fate, it's no longer fate, it's destiny. So I think that, and I think if we think in terms of constraints, we can make more sense of this, which is to say, for example, evil has this tendency where it can't be transparent. If it's transparent in its goals, it's kind of like a comedy. Like, hey guys, I'm gonna rob a bank. Like you can't tell someone openly you're gonna rob a bank, because it's just gonna be kind of funny. Like, who would actually say that if you actually intend on robbing a bank? So evil, whatever it constitutes, has constraints. But the problem with evil is that it gets ironically sealed with its fate, because if you lie, you have to keep up with your lies. Eventually, you get sealed by your fate on how long can you maintain this constraint. You're actually adding more constraints by the amount of lies that you have to maintain. Eventually, like Jockin was telling me just now, like eventually it ruptures. You meet your fate in that sense. So evil kind of by necessity it tries to ignore the necessities of constraint, but in trying to ignore the necessities of constraint, it actually just adds more constraints. You know, it's like I commit a murder. It's like, now how do I put the body? How do I make sure nobody knows? How do I make sure nobody's watching me? You instantly start suffocating your life, into which you literally seal your fate. Now, if we look at destiny might be that very thing where we have the necessity of constraints, and this would be perhaps in relation to beauty, where beauty creates new constraints. It's not a byproduct of me avoiding the necessity of constraints, as Joachim was telling me. It literally reworks the necessity of constraints. It gives us new necessity of constraints by replacing the old ones. It reveals something new to us. And I think that would be the different features of like goodness tries to maintain the necessity of constraints to a minimum. Because then that allows you to have more freedom, more transparency, more enjoyment in your life. Whereas beauty seems to be the very thing that literally transforms the necessities of constraints into new necessities of constraints, as Joachim was telling me. And so I think in that sense, that's destiny. It makes sense that there's freedom in that, in that kind of way. Whereas if we simply try to avoid fate, we get sealed by our fate. Like, so there's something just like hugely ironic about fate acting as a kind of constraint of necessity. But I'll leave it there.
I really like that distinction between fate and destiny. That is very interesting. I think also this notion of as you commit the crime, there's like you have like the problem with telling a lie is you have to tell a bunch of lies to maintain them, and eventually it all falls apart. So there is a kind of idea of fate as this closing hall, like a Kafka hallway. Like there's this closing that occurs. What's interesting, and I think when you're talking about this encounter with limit, there's some sort of sense in which there's an inevitability of encountering limit. And I think that's tied to religion. I think there's a theme. And what's interesting about the Greek tragedy is there's a suggestion that even if you're a hero, you encounter limitation, which like just because you're moral actually does not mean you or doing the right thing does not guarantee the avoidance of limit. And actually being the hero may make you less prepared for the limit, right? Or more kind of swept up in it in different things. Just because you're trying to fulfill your duty doesn't mean you don't end up like Arjuna having a very difficult talk with Krishna or something like that, right? So there's something then. So then the question becomes, is the moment of the transition from fate to destiny at the encounter of the limit and how one responds to it? And is freedom located in the ability to shift from fate to destiny? Like you have to choose either fate or destiny, and that's where freedom is, actually, right? Perhaps, but I'll slow down. So I actually bought this mobile battery thing. So if my battery, I found out there are no plugs around here, so I have no long idea how long this will last. We're gonna have fun this evening, but I'm gonna pass it to Seth and then Michael and Christian. Seth, thank you for being here, sir.
Yeah, great to be here. What came to mind might be similar to where Javier was going, but I wasn't thinking of it in the same language. But I'm definitely at a point, let's say, in life where I'm kind of asking almost every day, how did I get here? Right. So that's what came to mind when Sam brought up fate. And yeah, the distinction between like, oh, this is a mistake, I shouldn't be here, versus like, this is where I am and there must be a good reason for it. Of course, if I really want to have some sort of definitive answer, was it a mistake or not, I'm probably never going to get that, right? So I think this is one of those situations also where it's like, what's the most useful story to tell myself right now? Just in terms of my agency or something like that. Like in my own case, I went to college and studied music because that's what I really enjoyed. But I didn't really pop out of college like destined to be a career musician, right? And then I didn't sort of know what I was doing. And then I got involved with some activists. I went off to Cuba and I became a communist for nearly a decade and worked in factories. And then when that kind of came to an end, I was like, oh my God, what the hell does my resume look like? And anyway, from there I went to the Feldenkrais method. My joke used to be, well, I started with radical music and then I went into radical politics and now I do radical health. So maybe that's never going to be a big road to success. But years later, I look back and like this was actually chiming for me today, Daniel, as I was listening to some of the excerpts from your discussion of belonging again. Like, what did I learn from being a factory worker that I never would have learned, given the upbringing I had, middle class upbringing, whatever. I could pull out a lot of things, but one of the things I learned was like, oh, I can feel valuable and worthy because I can pick up something heavy, carry it somewhere else and put it down, which, for most of my school years, growing up and just looking at my family, I have father's a surgeon, my mother's a social worker, my sister is a lawyer. And it was like, well, you make your way in the world by being smart, right? And I didn't know how to play that game particularly, but so there was probably a part of me that saw working in a factory, getting involved in something radical that most people didn't understand, and then later leaving that behind and saying, how did I spend all that time? It could be like a mistake, right? But it's also the first time when I was in the factory that I experienced, I mean, maybe it happened as a young person playing soccer or something like that. But I definitely had flow states when I was at work. And I had flow states because I was working on a bandsaw. It was a noisy room. People were speaking multiple languages. People were screaming, singing. There was work to do. The boss was coming in and being an asshole to everyone. And just the whole dynamic, like on a night where I could just do my work, it was like I was dancing. And I remember certain nights where I was literally like confused. I was like, why do I just sort of think of picking something up and then I just noticed that I picked it up with no effort, and it just, I was like literally confused, So years later, I'm doing Feldenkrais work, and that's all. I mean, Feldenkrais talked about, when walking is well organized, it will feel like levitation, right? And when you feel that, it doesn't just change your physicality; it changes your whole concept of self. And anyway, I'm sort of could go in a lot of directions, but the point just being that the weird way I got here is really relevant now to the things I'm doing and thinking about. The other thing that I would say is like, for a while, I've been thinking about mystery or the unknown or the unpredictable as a very concrete category. Like there is 100% chance that there will be something in this situation I don't know. There's a 100% chance that, I don't know what anyone else on the Zoom screen is thinking right now. So of course, I think what we often try to do, and maybe this is kind of, I don't know, the legacy of rationality and making that the most important thing. We kind of, I think a lot of us learn or mislearn or get the impression that, things can be figured out. And you just don't leave any room for that wild card, which is always there. It's like it's always there. So that was just the last thing that it's like. I guess this is the famous thing from Socrates, right? He's wise because he knows that he doesn't know something. But I mean that is as guaranteed as the ground under my feet is that there will be an unknown. So I think I just love the topic because we're often trying to airbrush over the fact that there will always be a wild card. And so I think it's just really cool to foreground that. And then, I'm just curious to hear what everyone else is going to say about it as well.
Well, I think that's magnificent, and I'll give it to Michael and Sam. And I think what's very interesting is fate, almost for it to be of any relevance to us or to have in literature a sort of impact, has to have a certain surprise. Like, even if you're told the fate at the beginning of the story, it's surprising that it still happens, right? Or there's the surprise, like I always, with Greek tragedy, the obvious example is Sophocles' Odysseus. And it's this notion of, oh, I'm the one who does the thing, this one who ends up in that old prophecy, right? I didn't see that one. There's a certain surprise that occurs, right? And you could say, well, maybe the mistake was that he never made that calculation in his rational calculus. But you say, well, come on, how can you honestly have ever thought that thought, right? There's something also interesting about the outcome of a Greek tragedy that once you get the twist or the surprise, you're like, oh, I could see how that was possible. But it's also interesting how fate appears as if it could have been known that it was going to end up that way. But then when it occurs, like, but it really, you couldn't have. Right? Like you wouldn't have. It just was beyond the horizon of what is at hand and how you approach everydayness. I think there's also something very interesting about this notion that what is definitely fated is that something unexpected is going to occur, that something surprising is going to occur. And perhaps the likelihood of the encounter of the surprise of the fate being a tragedy is to the degree that you weren't expecting that, or you weren't ready, that you weren't thinking in terms of surprise. You were thinking in terms of being the hero or overcoming or doing everything right, right? You're actually kind of removing surprise and mystery from the calculus. And there are 5,000 mosquitoes out here. So if I die, that's why. But that element of surprise is also a very, very big deal. I love that phrase that walking should feel like levitation. But that also just brings to me how what's very interesting is how actually there is something about when the human feels in supreme, I'll say flow state, you could say happiness or joy, that it does feel like something is carrying them. It does feel as if there's a force beyond their freedom or choice that is operating independent of their agency. Like in the flow state, you kind of forget yourself. You don't actually know how you're doing the thing. It feels like you're just unfolding in a very mysterious way. And it is very interesting how there is something where humans seem to be at their best when they finally feel like they don't have to do everything. And yet, then the question is, how do you get into that state? And it involves a lot of effort. But then once you do all that effort, it makes it seem like you didn't need all that effort because now it just kind of flows, right? So there is something very interesting about how there's a revelation, I think, in discourses on fate, providence, karma, all of these different discourses in history that are speaking about forces that really are beyond human agency, that I think we need to take very seriously, because then also you simply see that it seems to be the case that humans are actually happiest or they function best when they have something that seems to be providing a foundation that is beyond them, that is structuring them. And then also it's interesting to think that even if you're fated, are you fated to interpret your past in a manner that put things together, right? You're talking about that ability to construct a story, even if there's some sort of fate. Are you fated in the story you tell about that fate, right? Maybe that's where there's a certain freedom, right? But let me give it to Michael here. Michael, please, good to have you this evening.
It's good to be here. Um, yeah, I'm really liking this conversation, and um, what Seth brought in, I really appreciate because it's kind of like I was talking with a friend today about kind of like vibe, and she's like, I don't believe in God, but I do have this sense that like there are callings in our life, that like this kind of instinctual callings towards certain people, environments. Like she just came back from living 3 months in Latin America, and like she learned Spanish for the last 2 years because she just had this like fascination with Latin American culture. She had never been anywhere in Latin America, but she just like had this feeling, and it was like confirmed, the whole time she was there. And I feel like something like Destiny is kind of more similar to that, where it's like it's to me at least, when I think about what is my destiny or things along those lines, like it's never like a concrete answer. It's more of like a general direction or like a field. Like, we talk sometimes on here about like resonant fields and things like that. Like it feels much more like that, where like fate, kind of talking about like what Javier was bringing in, like fate feels a lot more concretized and more definite, maybe more tangible, um, and it results in a like a decreasing of agency as opposed to an increasing of agency. And I think, destiny, like it opens like necessarily opens you up to a mystery that's like beyond your conception because it is still so ambiguous, and ever changing. And I think it requires a dialogue. Like it's almost like a being. Like it's because it's like when you follow your destiny, inevitably it's going to kind of be slightly beyond your grasp, or there's going to be impediments that are placed in your way, either self-imposed or imposed externally that require you to kind of figure out a way to get over those or get around those, or like change your ideas to fit kind of the moment. Um, and so I like the kind of like navigational metaphor about like following or like tracking uh your destiny. And I also feel like when you start thinking about your life, when you start asking that question that Seth asked, like how did I get here? It 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 almost kind of like subconsciously creates harmony between all of the things that you've done in your life to get to this place. Like it starts to unfragment what may seem like all these disjointed paths that you've taken, decisions that you've made, things things that have happened to you, trials and tribulations. And it like I heard recently a quote by I want to say it's St. Augustine, I can't remember, where they said like faith is finding harmony and fragmentation or something like that, or like the spiritual life. And I so I wonder from that like how much fate and destiny is already like an ontological reality, and how much do we have agency to place meaning on it? Are we placing the meaning that's already there, or in making meaning and kind of trying to find this coherent through line, um, does that actually potentially alter our destiny for the rest of our life? Because like if you kind of can see coherences and things that haven't been coherent, in my experience, it gives me a lot. It just kind of injects me with like a new sense of life, where I can often feel like, what the hell am I doing with my life? Like my resume is just a hodgepodge of random things that I've done, and like how do like it's always like how do I make myself marketable is like always the question. But I feel like when I can drop into a space of really making sense of my life, I kind of go beyond the kind of like capitalistic mindset of like how do I did you get one there, Daniel? Yeah. Like how like it goes beyond that to like, oh, I kind of see some through line of like what I've been searching for my whole life, and then that can like influence where I continue to go. So yeah, there's a lot of curiosities. I'm reading a book for school right now called Callings, and I feel like it's very relevant to this discussion. It's been a really interesting book to read. But yeah, I'll pass it back.
Fantastic. Very interesting as you were speaking. I'll give it to Sam here. So it's funny because when somebody says they want purpose, doesn't that in a way mean they want a kind of destiny, a certain limitation? Because, I want a purpose, which automatically has to have a certain pruning function to it, right? It's interesting as well. Philip Reeve has that lovely line where he says people don't want to choose, they want to be chosen, Well, if you're chosen, I mean, I think that's what people say. It's like, oh, I'm chosen. I have a destiny, right? Well, it's very interesting because there's a certain limitation then, right? There are things, there's a limitation there. And isn't it interesting where when people have a destiny, they can feel like they have an increase in agency, not a decrease. And yet if we think about it, this would mean there has to be some sort of limitation because if you have a destiny, that means you're doing X instead of Y, right? But then there's also a sense in which I say you have a destiny. It can mean prove yourself worthy of it, prove yourself able to realize your destiny, right? Which that's very interesting because it would suggest that there's a latent potentiality that could or may not be realized. Interesting. So what's that? Also, as you were speaking in Sartre, there's obviously essence before existence or existence before essence, that kind of idea. And what's the difference between destiny or fate and alignment with existence? There's that classic idea that if you don't align with existence, then you're not going to be fully human, right? Is that the same as destiny or fate? Are there differences here, et cetera, so forth? I think it's fascinating, but I'll give it to Sam and then Christian. Miss Willem, please.
Yeah, I'd actually like to expand this conversation kind of beyond like this the polis and like our roles that we play in society and how we market ourselves and stuff like that. Because I think that what Greek plays are trying to get at is something a little like, actually I question the statement. I was going to say something a little bit more personal or like unique to the individual, but at the same time, like the sort of like expression of the uniqueness of a soul, maybe that's actually quite a new like concept. I don't know, but I guess I really like that distinction that you made, Javier, between destiny and fate, like a closing down of possibility, um, like versus like this renewing of the limit. That's really nice. And and also Seth, like this idea of the concept of the self, to me, at least maybe not in an actual Greek tragedy, but today and today, like thinking of what destiny can mean for us today, I think it's hugely important. And it's definitely like what I've been thinking about is like how mystery itself, because we're human beings and we have this faculty of being able to imagine that which is not, like we can imagine alternatives to the way that things currently are. And so, you know, that opens up like all these, just like opens one to the idea of mystery. Um, and I think that kind of rearranges the concept of the self. I feel like we have in many traditions, like sort of like um, a diagram of like a two-part self, the self that like the ego say, and then there's like something daemonic, like daemonic and as in the Socratean daemon, like there's like this true self, and the true self might know things that the conscious, audible thoughts don't. Um, and the kind of the time-bound self needs some sense of intrinsic rightness where in the surprise it begets there is the recognition that this is like who I am or where I'm going. And actually the thing that made me bring this up is like in my personal life I was thinking back to a time that I just kept having these quite persistent series of dreams. And the dreams themselves had pestered me into taking on, like, doing something that I didn't want to do. And nonetheless did it. And now that we're like many years out from that, and I think about all the things that begot, like, I don't think it, like, like it's hard, there are no controls to the experiment of life. But I really don't think I would know any of you if, like, I think there's like a way in which I found a more true version of myself through that action and never even had a sense like it wasn't even like I really don't think in that particular situation that is like maybe it is meaning making, but I guess from the a looking back and a finding a sense through all the events, but I really felt I felt annoyingly pestered by these dreams, and like I didn't think anything was missing, or like, like there was, yeah, and I didn't even think that going through with what the dreams were bugging me about, I didn't know what they wanted. I did my best to obey them, and as I did my best to obey them, um, life changed in ways that I didn't even think it would be that effective. And when it comes to freedom, it's like in that particular situation, I think if I hadn't done so much reading of Jung, I just would have ignored them. Like it was sort of contingent upon a certain degree of freedom that I had cultivated for myself through the concepts that Jungian psychoanalysis allowed me, like a freedom of openness to things that, like allowed allowed my freedom, my cultivated freedom allowed a destiny in a way that, yeah, that's what I meant, I guess, by that.
I think that's magnificent. So I'll give it to Christian, Javier, Mr. Jonkin. So two things. First, one of the ways I think about the Greek tragedy, and I even associate this with all the Kingsmen and Pinworn, and I could go on. There's a notion that if you go to high enough, we could say, in the heroic or in leadership, in a position of social authority, you will eventually encounter an experience that it feels like something beyond you, a circumstance was waiting for you, as if it was always going to encounter, and now you have to make a choice, a very difficult choice. And it feels as if I almost just want to say reality itself was structured as such that this was always latent. And the more you climb the ladder, the more that latency came out. And then when you experience it, it's as if it was always already there. So the way Martha Numsborg puts it is he kind of says, a tragedy is a trade-off of competing goods. And the nature of reality is such that you eventually get to a place where you have to make that choice. And it is tragic because you have to choose between freedom and justice, serving the gods, serving your family, and et cetera, so forth. But the likelihood of you experiencing this tragedy is tied to how high you climb. I'm just going to say it that way. If you don't try to climb high, you never experience a trade-off of competing goods, right? You could also think of Job, because there's a notion of Job not doing anything wrong, but because he has a certain holiness, there are these forces then behind the scenes that he gets caught up in that can't be boiled down to a rational calculus, right? You can only kind of respond to it, right? So there's this idea almost that there's an infrastructure in the background of reality that will come out, that will only come out to the degree in the Greek tragedy that one climbs as much as they can. So there's that concept. There's another concept in some theological notions that can be called almost the sacred romance, which I associate with what you were speaking there, Sam, Miss Willem, is a notion of this almost this experience of a wooing to reality. That there are these certain things almost wooing you, saying, try this, come this way. And you don't have to listen to them. And it's kind of weird that this thing stands out to you, or this dream keeps pestering you, but then you choose to do it, and it unveils an entire world or course of life that you otherwise wouldn't have even known, you wouldn't have known about. That there's a certain wooing to reality, actually. And it's very, very mysterious. It comes out of nowhere. You meet this person you didn't expect to meet. And why did you happen to take that turn at that point and it changed your entire life, right? It could all just be random contingency. It could have not happened. But then it feels like that's a very mechanism of the meaning that it creates that is so powerful. The contingency is actually part of the structure to give it the thrust of its power, right? But then that could just be rationalization. But of course, it has to have the possibility of just being rationalization in order to have this opening for agency that is mixed with structure. And so there's a wooing. And we can always think about wooing and romance as give and take, a kind of dance. There's in a romance, in a relationship, there's your agency, and then there's sacrifice. There's following a structure, and then there's knowing when to break the structure for the sake of the other. There's a kind of dance going on. And the sacred romance, and I'll expand on that, it's a very important topic. And I often associate people thinking of providence or even, providence beauty forms with some sort of intuition of reality having a kind of sacred romance to its structure. There is something where precisely the attunement to this operation in reality, which I would associate with authentic resonance, as Aspasia, Seth, and I have been talking about, this kind of awareness of things. And I think actually you can learn it in your body. You learn to trust yourself more and more. This seems to be where the human actually find. I don't know if you find freedom. I don't know if you ever feel free if you never have an experience of the sacred romance, because then it's hard to feel free if you don't feel as if there's something in operation beyond you that's wooing you. Because then it's all you, and that anxiety destroys you. You're destroyed by the freedom, actually. But when you know that there's something in operation, then that can be supportive. But of course, the risk here is, isn't that just magical thinking, or are you on the board of New Ageism or something like that? That always is the risk. But then when you look through the literature and you look through many, many traditions, there's this mystery of playing with this idea of, again, a sacred romance, of fate. There is this possibility of the human having experiences that unveils to them there is something in operation beyond them that nevertheless is contingent. And you can always wonder if that's just all in your head. And yet that is a very mechanism of why it can feel chosen or it can feel meaningful. It has to have that possible disavow if it is to have any thrust in its motivation. But of course, that could just all be rationalization. But of course, that needs to be a possibility for it to maintain that. And of course, that could be rationalization. But that's a possibility of it to maintain its meaning, on and on. So let me give it to Christian, Javier, Mr. Jochen, and then Seth. Christian, thank you for being here, sir.
Yeah, this topic really gets my mind swimming. And it reminds me of high school, my AP English class. We had to write a paper on, what was the story? I can't even remember. I just remember I got points off my paper because instead of talking about divine providence, I like made up a term that I called the gravity of fate. And I was pissed because our teacher told us to like be creative. And he like used this example of some paper someone wrote the year before, and it was this really terrible like Disney analogy or something. Anyways, I thought, well, gravity of fate, that's pretty creative. Points off my paper. But it's coming back to me now. It kind of works in a metaphorical way that and I don't know, where to put the word gravity and where to put the word fate and where to put the word destiny and or providence. But to speak a little more generally, the metaphor of gravity, I think, can be interesting because gravity pulls us to Earth, and so that's a constraint, right? We're stuck. I can try to jump, but I get pulled right back down. On the other hand, without that gravity, I wouldn't have much freedom per se, right? I would just be floating in a non-gravitational whatever space. And then of course, I also need to have my own mass in order to be attracted to the center of this big blue orb. So I see like I don't know, well, it's a cliche, right? Like limitations give you freedom. To me, the reason why it's hard for my mind to settle anywhere with this is because it asks us to think about freedom, or at least we tend to think about freedom in terms of decision-making possibilities. And that can lead us to questions about free will. And, who is it that is making a decision at the end of the day? And I don't have anything that I feel like really satisfies this question. And I kind of suspect that nothing ever will satisfy the question, despite how much conviction people have about questions of free will, one way or the other. But lately, I've been thinking about consciousness as kind of a a nothingness, an emptiness in the Buddhist sense, a zero in the mathematical sense, um, or a lower dimensional order of reality is one way I've been thinking about it. Um, and I wish I had more of like a discipline of mathematical theory because I could think about it in at least a metaphorical mathematical way. But I've done some research on this, and I want to say that it's like maybe something like consciousness is a lower dimensional mm, manifestation of reality that interacts with a higher dimensional, like space-time, 40, let's call it 40 and 3D or something like this. Um, and that uh, the, 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 the mysterious process by which four-dimensional reality collapses into a lower dimensionality of a lower dimension of reality that we call consciousness. Um, and you know, whatever, who knows? It's microtubules in the brain. It's electromagnetic fields. Who the fuck knows? But in the abstract, at least, that relationship between the two, which is not quite like a classical dualism, but is a difference in dimensionality. It creates causal power. I don't know. This is all very speculative, but you know, and it doesn't tell you much about what it means to have free will. But it could at least tell you why we have a sense of free will, which is to say that we have a kind of intuition or felt sense that there is a causal power shaping reality, which is non-material. Or I'm saying non-material, but I mean just lower dimensional. You can call that whatever you want. But it's something that is not just, you know, the billiard balls or the you know, quantum potentiality of the billiard balls in 3D 4D space time, but something else that still yet has a causal, probably a bilateral causal relationship with that. Anyways, so then, you know, what might all this like speculation tell us about gravity or fate or anything like this? Um, I am wondering if just having for the mind, for the active mind to kind of create to include within its model of reality this very dynamic of dimensional collapse, like a non-material causality that has something to do with our phenomenological experience, which in turn has something to do with like pure witnessing. Call it what you want, the great witness, God consciousness, something like this. Um, if we kind of cook that into our mental model of reality, it doesn't tell us that you can like then get a grip on that causal power because it's like not within this dimension. It's something kind of else. But it can maybe help us not make, let's say, mistakes in our thinking where we forget to account for this causal power. Um, and in doing that, in kind of having a certain kind of openness to some kind of fundamental non-material causal power, call it God or something like that, whatever you'd like, um, then we can sorry, really at the edge of my thoughts here. Um, model, fold that into the model of reality, openness, it's damn. I don't know if I can. Maybe I actually just can't put it into words. That could be a cop out. But I want to say something like uh, maybe it puts you in a reflective state that allows your model of reality to essentially be more adaptive, let's say.
Yeah, yeah.
Something like that. So fucking abstract. But anyways, I try my
No, but
best.
there's actually, if you put it into words, there's a way in which it loses the freedom because then it has a particular expression, right? And so ultimately, if you're talking about I associate what you're speaking with, and I've been speaking with Seth about it. So there's a few things. There's perceiving and thinking. Right now, I am perceiving the police station across from this free place, and there's no one looking at me. But I perceive this phenomenon, right? And now I'm thinking about it because I'm thinking about if anyone is going to come out and tell me to leave, right? But perceiving and thinking are different. But here's the funny thing, I can only think about perceiving, and then it's not what it is. In order to just purely perceive, I have to kind of stop thought, right? And what's very interesting is I think the feeling that we have freedom comes a lot from the ability to turn on thought and focus, and for the phenomenologist, intentionality. I can look at that van instead of that flagpole, and I can focus on one thing versus the other. And that feels as if I am able to add something to materiality, if you will, that is not there. In the same way as the rock, the very act of focus or intentionality itself. And I know Adam Robert just had a book that he put out on cultivating intention and attention as a ethical act. There is something about attention, that the ability to attend, the ability to focus, that seems strongly tied to the question of freedom. But then the question is the attention primarily from the orientation of serving perception or serving thinking? And if you say it's primarily about serving thinking, then you're going to ask questions about, does the individual have freedom, free will? Because the individual thinks. But if you ask it from the place of perception, you're asking, is there something in operation in the phenomenon that is organizing in such a manner that I can go along for the ride? And that actually there's something about freedom found in the going along with the ride, like going with how things are unfolding. And actually realizing the distinction between thinking and perceiving helps one be open to go along with the ride. It is also interesting to think if instead of asking, do we have free will, we almost, to use Javier's language, and then I'll give it to Mr. Rivera, Jock and Seth and Michael, is the question is, do we have destiny or fate? Maybe that's the question of free will. And instead of asking, do we have free will, it's interesting to ask, do we have destiny or fate? Because right there, that suggests a choice. Do we have destiny or fate? And yet it is also interesting how it is not so readily individualized. Because the moment you talk about destiny and fate, you're talking about something almost by it, like you wouldn't really talk about that if you just believed radically in the individual. Destiny and fate seem to be a testament to something beyond the individual, a certain relationality, a certain setting by definition, right? And then it's interesting to ask, do you have destiny or fate? Because that would also almost suggest, have you done the cultivation of your world in a manner that it is on the side of destiny versus the side of fate, perhaps? It is interesting to wonder that. And then if there is something about a sacred romance, based on it seems to be on the side of thinking serving perception more than perception serving thinking. It is more on the side of this kind of openness that you're trying to maintain, that you can figure out how to go along with the ride. And then I would associate that with surprise, beauty, et cetera, so forth. And there does seem to be something about consciousness that, oddly enough, is a lower resolution, because consciousness is translating phenomenon like the van into the word van in my mental construct of van. And yet the van in its perception of it, the role, because you also have a problem with the word consciousness, could mean the act of perception and intentionality, or it can mean the thinking act, right? Consciousness, when it is primarily in the thinking mode, almost seems to be a lower resolution than when it is primarily perceiving phenomenon. Oh, but if you don't move to thinking, then the perceived phenomenon are meaningless. And it seems as if the causal agency that is beyond the billiard balls is found in the movement between thinking and perceiving. It is actually located in the metaxis, the ability to move between those activities, which then means you're always dealing with a vanishing mediator, because the thing of which is the agency is in the between that you can't stay in, only move out of. You have a moment where you glimpse it and then it's gone. There's a moment where it glimmers and then it's gone. And the ability to maintain that motion seems to have something to do with this question of agency. But I'll pause and give it to Mr. Rivera. Mr. Rivera, please.
Yeah, no, well put. I think because I'm still thinking about like Sam's question about this individual tendency. Um, but I guess I'll first address this idea of a lot of theology, and this kind of goes with your point, Daniel, but like thinking should serve perceiving, because a lot of theology is concerned with the quality of the knower. And if it has to do with the quality of the knower, then we have to, in some sense, change our perceiving. If we perceive in such a way that we think in such a way, then that gives a quality to consciousness. And that quality of consciousness sort of affects the way we live. And so we have to change our perception in order to change our thinking, in order to then change our quality of consciousness. But what's interesting about the free will debate thing is like, even if we have free will, even if it's like Christian was saying, like it's just like bare possibilities, we're still not like asking the question of like, why do we experience? Right? Like everyone's like, what is experience? What is consciousness? It's like, that seems great, but if we don't add a constraining question about what is experience for, then perhaps we might understand exactly what experience is. But we don't ask that question. We don't say what is thinking for. We just say what is thinking. Because there seems to be something constraining once we add what is it for though? Because if we just have freedom to pick possibilities, then to me, why don't we just go with determinism? Why aren't we just determined to pick possibilities? Right? There seems to be a pruning principle involved in which experience is made for something. What is it made for? And then so I have this other notes here, and I hope I don't steal Jock and thunder. I'm like, Jock, and I hope I don't steal your thunder. So so Sam was talking about this idea of individual uniqueness, perhaps. Theology actually did cater to this, and it had to do with the individual's expression of the divine. So in Islam, the divine names, if you could cultivate yourself in such a way, you could actually express a certain divine name of God, and that would actually be unique in itself because God is unique. So there is a sense in which the individual could express a very unique quality. If I were to connect it to Christian's idea, it's you expressing this unique quality is expressing the higher order causality. Can you express the higher order causality from your consciousness? Can you cultivate your consciousness in such a way to express the higher order causality? So to me, that would be the individual unique expression. And you can find this everywhere. Like Buddhism has this, right? Like enlightenment, the fact that individuals can be enlightened already have a kind of unique expression of enlightenment. Or if we take like the mystics or the saints seriously, they all have they have a kind of uniqueness to them in a kind of way. Although maybe not perfect, but it does show that the uniqueness starts coming out the more that they cultivate this kind of quality of consciousness. Yeah, I'm trying to see if I add everything that I want to say. Oh yeah, so if we connect what is experience for would be a constraining principle to indicate that we have a participatory reality. We have to participate. Why do we have to participate? Well, it seems that would lead us to the next thing, that there's something about fate and destiny that can only become actual if we participate in it. So it's experience, participatory reality, destiny, fate. For some reason, reality is constructed in such a way that we have to experience, and we have to learn from our experience. Why do we have to learn from our experience? This is the very interesting thing of just like, why is it a pruning principle that I have to learn from my experiences? Why am I not just an automaton? So yeah, just in there.
No, magnificent. I'll give it to Mr. Jock. I think there is absolutely a classic theological idea that the only way and a funny way to be an individual is to be a saint. Like, if you're not a saint, you're actually not an individual. An individual is kind of a counterfeit of the definitiveness, as I like to talk about, of the saint, right? And the whole point is to be a saint. And of course, how do you do that? Because that's not obvious. And this is where something like divine romance, a certain sort of cultivating, you have to cultivate a quality of perception to even see the way to become a saint. You can't think it. The qualitative change, if you will, in the realm of perception has to come first. And of course, what do all the religious traditions talk about? Well, a lot of body practices to Seth Work's Testament, fasting, praying. You know, it's funny how you actually have to do body things first in order to gain the ability to perceive the directionality of sainthood. I think it's extremely well put, and I love what you said on the divine names. I think that is exactly right. The point of why freedom, experience of, we have to learn this way. Well, it is, as a quick little note, it would be funny because perhaps freedom allows the ability to choose destiny and it be meaningful. Because if you weren't free, then the destiny you had would not have actually, well, it wouldn't have that divine quality. It is interesting how things that have a divine quality feel chosen and beyond you. Like you choose them, but they don't need you to choose them. They're beyond, you choose them, and yet they are not just your choice. That, well, a divine thing, if you will, is that which you choose, and its greatness or beauty is not because you chose it. Like there's a way, let me say it this way. If you choose a Kit Kat, then its goodness comes in the fact that the consumer chose it. Well, it must be better than Hershey's because it's chosen over the Hershey bar or something, right? So most commodities, there's a way in which their value comes from if people choose them, if consumers choose them. And I would say most of the time we're dealing with in everyday life, you're dealing with things that value comes from the act that they are chosen, right? That they're X versus Y. Divine things are that which you choose, and and that isn't why they're valuable. They are chosen because they are beautiful. It's not the act of choosing that makes them thus, right? But this is so counterintuitive or counter to what 90% of our experience is, because 90% it's us. We are the kind of confirmation of the value in the act of choice. But there's a reversal that occurs there that by definition would have to speak about a certain infrastructure and reality that is beyond the individual, right? More would have to be said, but it's very interesting what you were saying. But let me give it to Mr. Jock and Seth, and then Michael and Sam. Like, Mr. Jockin, good to see you, sir.
I think on that point, Javier, I think your noted as destiny versus fate point is really good. But I think also especially Sam's notes, it's interesting because I think it's definitely true that moderns, we come with a presuppositional assumption everybody's an individual, when for the ancients, it is something that had to be earned. Names was the honor that great heroes acquired by their virtue. And actually, that was the whole point of their immortality, was basically the fame gained and their honor of the name being passed on in history and time. So thus the idea is kind of like out of that aggregational mass, heroes of great names reveal themselves. And that's that kind of, so actually that very analogous. Actually, that's why Aquinas is able to talk about greatness of soul from virtue ethics, from Aristotle, and convert it into a Christian modality where that could be considered, if they wanted to argue that big pride, that's why sometimes that translation of greatness of soul as pride gets kind of challenging from a Christian point of view, but he's able to reconcile it because of this point that basically when one is basically participating in the divine names, either that concept applies both in Christian mysticism as well as Islamic mysticism, that one participates in those divine names, it actually works analogously like the names of honor that the ancient Greeks had operated on. So I actually see a relationship in that approach, but it does show that kind of reversal effect. Basically, in the past, this is individuality was something that had to be earned, versus now it's a kind of presumption at the start. But yet, I think Sam, your other note of that kind of quiet whisper, that glimmering. So sometimes we talk about glimmers of beauty, when there's also whispers of beauty too. And I think that I say this because Aristotle has a note called synesis, which gets translated as understanding. But there's also another concept associated like that in Aquinas called syndricity. It is a natural disposition that apprehends the first principles. It's basically, I'm saying this in the sense what Sam was bringing up about that kind of whisper of an intuition, or in a mode of a dream too, right? A dream that was giving you a vision or a whisper to engage in something you would normally not do. And this leads to kind of the big note is that, I find it interesting in life, making huge bets on people tends to reveal new possibilities in a way that no other kind of bet ever generates. And I think, Sam, your note about that intuition to reach out on the internet, and by the way, that's all about how all of us met. I can also attest to that personally as well. I always found that the times when I truly committed to an individual, to another, something revelationally new revealed itself. And that reminds me, and I kind of bridging in a note from Javier, my conversation with Javier and Luber this afternoon, the logics of self-interest are always there. Aristotle actually, I always talk about this language of Aristotle actually blows up the selflessness versus selfishness distinction by pointing out a different model about it. But the more relevant point about it is, so acts of beauty reveal a new possibility that actually that maintain the old relationship but supersede it. So what I mean by that is, one must be self-interest is a natural reality, yet virtue allows you a certain relationship of friendship. And it's in the relationships of friendship that new possibilities of relationship are possible, because Aristotle says a friend of virtue is another self. It's kind of interesting how that works. So thus basically, and actually that's why when there's a friendship and there's a love in that friendship, the success and the thriving of that friend is actually a glory for yourself. And also that's why Aristotle has notes that actually it's better, even though acts of virtue that are glorious and good beauty are great, it's actually even better if you allow a friend to do it. You actually reduce the situations that a friend achieves the beautiful as opposed to yourself. And your reward is the witnessing of that, because it's another self. You're seeing yourself do it when they do it, which thus isn't that interesting that actually it's both. It does the double move at the same time. It's actually ironic, the most selfish move is it's the self. It's you. You're seeing yourself in beauty, but yet it's another, and it's actually in their benefit they glorify. Another example, actually, and I think it was Christian's point with gravity. I don't know why, but in the net group, I keep running back to the image of flight, because that is a perfect example of this reversal of fate and destiny, or again, the complete switch that occurs. Because when flight was an absolute impossibility, we thought it was the greatest fantasy that thought of a man could fly, and yet we didn't completely obliterate the laws of gravity and necessities of gravity. We superseded it. We revealed a new possibility. A posterior truth revealed itself, which of course always hides away as soon as the moment it comes up, when it reveals itself, and we take it for granted. But I'm just reminded that image came to mind with Christian's note about gravity. I am sorry that professor or instructor marked out your grades, Christian. That's tyranny. That was a lack of creative freedom and thought, imagination in that sense. There was also another note related. It's from physics. I remember correctly. I think it's from physics from Aristotle, on the difference. It's called chance, fortune, and spontaneousness. But the Greek of it is where basically it's the word for automatron comes from it. So I'm thinking about this idea that with chance, which is actually, and as that nature has that, but not spontaneity, where there's a kind of bridging of chance as fortune with destiny, and fate with automaton, kind of an automatic necessity and consequence. And that's another point. There's actually two kinds of necessity. There's the kind of akinness. There's basically that mode, and then there's a korora, which is basically it's like conditional necessity versus absolute necessity. There is also a distinction in that. What I mean by that is, sometimes what happens is when a person starts an initiation of an act, there's consequences that come from that. And actually, one of them, and actually what Javier's note about, your kind of attentional state makes all the difference. The decision on what kind of attentional state one chooses to enter into gives a dispositional condition that when you enter new circumstances of surprise of a new event that you cannot prepare for, cannot plan for, your response is contingent on that preparation that came beforehand. The example I use, it's a toy example, but I do like it because it's very true. It's when I had a lecture to give on my book release. I go to the bar. There's no audio. There's no AV. You got nothing. You're in a bar that's fully packed out. It's Friday afternoon, evening, happy hour. And guess what? I'd absolutely right to just in righteous anger just say no, I'm not going to do it, or I'm not going to involve with it. But then I chose otherwise because I was like, I made the commitment. I'm here. We got to just make this work. And there's other constant examples actually with members in this group where there's times where, do I want to talk to someone? Do I want to do this thing? And I was like, well, I'm doing this. It's actually that commitment to the relationship to individuals. So I tend to find that these glimmers and whispers and visions of the beautiful tends to show up in that movement. And last notice, because then the idea of two souls, the daemon and the fault and that other self, Christianity and Islam mysticism has that same stance, the nafs and the ruh, that same model exists there. There's a kind of the operation of attention. It's a very different thing than thought, and we keep getting psyched out that we think the thought, which is by the way Eunoia, it's through nous thinking. We think that's what the self is, and that is where everything's occurring. When there's something more foundational occurring in attention, and those subtleties of switching, which one do we attend to, and which fate, and basically the change of fate to a destiny does seem to come down to what we put our attention to. And I tend to find friendship, the people we care about, is usually a whisper to remind us that's probably the most important thing to do in our lives. That's all I have.
Magnificent. And I very much like the idea that the difference between fate and destiny seems to come down to attention, which is subtle, and what we choose to attend to. And there is something about attending to people, the potentiality of friendship that seems it seems to uniquely increase the probability of the conditions being met for the possibility of these whispers and glimmers that seem to go into the direction in which humans seem to thrive and the beautiful is unveiled. I think that is exactly right. And I think there is actually something where it is very difficult to find belonging again when you do not find yourself in circumstances where the dynamic of friendship is afforded that you were describing, where you are participating in a transformation of another person that simultaneously is transforming you, because that seems to be the very kind of experience that is evidence of belonging. Because you're here and you're changing them, and they belong here because they're changing you. Oh, so this must be where we belong. And of course, the word belonging is lovely because there is a belonging. There is an eros in the word belonging that is in a sort of eros longing. And if there's something about friendship that has a love, philo, that is also at its best some sort of attunement to this sacred romance or these whispers, then that is going to be deeply connected to this question of belonging again. So I appreciate that very much. I will give it to Seth and Michael. The last thing I'll say, as you were speaking, it occurred to me, it's very interesting because there's also a way in which when people demand justice, they're demanding fate. Like there's a way in which we get upset if evil does not get punished, right? There's a way in which we get upset if goodness does not lead to prosperity, right? So it's very interesting too, just as a note, that actually very often, although when we talk about fate and destiny, just like in terms of free will, there's a way in which, it's, oh no, that's not good. That's not good. But actually, when you talk in terms of justice, we want it. The whole idea of justice is that things lead to what they ought to lead to, that that we make sure that cause and effect, that there is a certain fate. You could say that a just society is one where the wicked have a fate and the good have a destiny. Now, I know that's too black and white, but, that's perhaps the ideal to us, right? But that right there suggests that we are longing for something beyond just individual choice. Because if we just wanted individual choice, then we wouldn't care if the wicked led to the wicked and the good led to the good, if you will, right? We would just, okay, people are choosing, that's fine, right? So there is, in that very conversation about justice and other social rights and so on and so forth, a notion that there should be a structure in the background that organizes things one way versus the other. And it was very interesting too when you were talking about the individual has replaced the hero. I think that's exactly right. The problem is that the term hero requires a social order. So there has to be others, right? Because the heroic is defined by the social order, right? In which things are valued, right? In which there is a ought that the hero can be realized in, where courage is valued, and et cetera, so forth, right? So in the name of freeing us from the tyranny of the social, perhaps, there was a loss of the possibility of the heroic, where even if you are an individual, who cares? You're just you're a non-playable character, an NPC, as Seth was alluding to, right? But then there's also a problem if the hero is defined in a manner that serves the good at the expense of the beautiful, because then the heroic is serving a tyrant, or it is getting rid of the other, or taking down minorities. So you've had that problem. But what would it mean to think the heroic in terms of beauty, as we often talk about, where the beautiful is not collapsed into the good? Well, I think there's something heroic about the cultivation of friendship in the manner that was being described, or to have the courage to invest in people and to be there for people in the way that Mr. Jockin was describing, and that the heroic is found in that dedication. There is something heroic about maintaining a relationship to give rise to the quality of the geopadic. And also, it's just very interesting because there's a way in which, there's a way in which saint includes hero, but hero does not necessarily include saint, perhaps. And perhaps hero, and the issue is perhaps it's individual, hero, saint. And it's kind of like we talk about the beauty includes the true and the good, but, not necessarily the other way around. And where in a historic age where the beautiful is needed, now we need to more emphasize the saint. And there's something about sainthood that is actually in the act of friendship. There's something about a friend with God or something, et cetera, so forth, right? That would have to be expanded on, but those thoughts were coming to mind. And I do think this notion, there is something about the whisper, which is a beautiful phrase. And again, when I speak of the sacred romance, the wooing of reality, glimmers and glimpses, I have these things in mind. It does seem to be the case that there is something about friendship that uniquely conditions the possibility of the individual to have these experiences, and thus it would only be the fate of a society that doesn't care for the beautiful that it would thus have a friend session. But maybe we can change that and have a different destiny. But let me go to Seth and Michael, and then if anyone has other things. This thing looks like it actually works. The computer has not died, and it's plugged into this mobile battery. I'm amazed. But Seth, please.
Yeah, loving the conversation. And I think I've started to understand how to process the net. So I've actually been taking notes, underlining. I'm sort of prepared to talk now. Hopefully I don't go on too long for everyone, but one of my confusions here has been how does anyone actually follow the last person? But I'm starting to get it. So but that means that a lot of, at least where I want to begin, comes from earlier in the conversation, and I'm also just kind of interested that maybe if my theory that what I'm doing is what other people do, that they take notes, then the conversation would be sort of a looping back 5 or 10 minutes at least with each person, or maybe it loops further back the further we get into the. Anyway, I had this. Well, one thing I've noticed is that, at least for me, but maybe for others, part of how I learn is through mantra. And what I mean is, I can read a book and underline and write an essay and get all my thoughts together if I'm prepared. But when I'm sort of in the middle of a situation, the best I can do is remember certain catchphrases, from the last insight I had. And so they kind of come back. And one of the catchphrases I had that I think relates to this, and it's, of course, my favorite stuff always has a musical bent to it. So it was that the idea was the universe doesn't play wrong notes. And something that's kind of bound up in that, and speaking to my own history. So I was involved in music in a very avant-garde kind of musical community. So I enjoyed, or at least endured, a lot of music that other people would not listen to. They just ran out of the room. That's noise, right? That's too discordant. And looking back on some of it, there's things that I can't believe I listened to, but then there's also things that I appreciate because I spent the time hanging out with something that seemed discordant long enough to, kind of realize, oh, there's something interesting here. Like a simple insight I got was, some melodies will resolve in a few seconds, but some melodies take about 35 minutes to resolve. And if you're willing to listen for 35 minutes, you can actually have this really glorious kind of arrival. Of course, there's certain music that's just like pure noise, and you have to relate to that in different ways. But I think one thing we can do, if I guess I'm coming back a little bit to the frame I used before, like how the hell did I get here? What's going on in my life? So one of the potential tricks is to take anything that I wish wasn't so, anything that's uncomfortable or painful, and call it a lesson, right? And sometimes that feels like just like force feeding myself vegetables. That sometimes it's just, it's not necessarily helpful when like you go through a breakup and your friend tells you, oh, well, I'm sure it's be a learning experience. It's like, go away, shut up, but it can be. And just, there's this beautiful story that I heard about Miles Davis that kind of comes to this. And funny enough, I don't even know if it's true, because I sort of heard the story retold by someone who heard retold or something. But if it's true, or if it isn't, we can just appreciate it anyway. But apparently a musician who was in Miles's band talks about, well, I was on stage and, I would be just so scared because like I'm standing next to Miles and then I play a wrong note and like, what the hell, I just ruined, the show. But then it was like, but then Miles would just play something right after me and it no longer sounded like it was no longer a wrong note, right? It's like, but the idea is like, how, if we accept the story as, whether true or not, how would that work? It's like Miles has a way of listening that hears something that sounds like way off, and it's just like, oh, how do we resolve that? It does, and of course in music, really the note feels wrong or doesn't feel wrong based on what comes before and after. There's this sort of elasticity of time there. So yeah, I wanted to bring that in, So this is a way of sense making, right? If I say this thing that's uncomfortable is kind of a lesson, maybe it isn't a lesson, but I can assert that to myself. And kind of jumping to something that Thomas said, if you're kind of setting the posture of your attention. And so even without knowing what's happening next, I can walk in and just say, I feel like being friendly to everyone in the room. Who knows how they're going to act, but I'm going to be friendly today. You can sort of set your posture that way with your attention. And, so this relates to your orientation. And I think that one of the signals we get back, like to what Christian was talking about, maybe there's this other level of reality that we can't quite perceive, but it's there. And I think someone used the phrase, it winks back at you. But I think one of the ways it winks back to you, back to this notion of the flow state, is the feeling of effort. So if I make a proposition like, I'm going to walk into this room and be friendly to everyone, and it turns out that everyone in the room just bullies me, and like, I might think, oh, I seem to be getting the response from reality that I chose the wrong orientation, this feels really effortful. And then I maybe switch to, okay, I'm going to, show everyone how tough I am. Oh, maybe that actually works better in this situation. Now it feels more effortless. So that sense of effort. And I thought it'd be fun to share, because I used this phrase before from Feldenkrais, that when walking is organized properly, it can feel like levitation. And actually, I mentioned I was working in the factories. It was when I was still doing factory work that I discovered the Feldenkrais method, and I was doing a little bit of a thing you can do on your own, listening to a recording, but then I visited a practitioner, who did hands-on work with me for a while. And I had a day at the factory around this time when I was walking across the floor, and the way I experienced it is I took a step, and then I took another step, and I shot through the roof up into the sky. I mean, that's literally what happened in my phenomenology. It was like all the weight went out of my body, and it was so disorienting because I just didn't feel the weight of my body for a moment or two. The way I would try to explain that rationally is like I just found clarity of my posture and like the alignment of the bones in my body with the floor that was maybe better than I'd ever experienced it before. So I wasn't actually weightless, but relative to anything that I had ever felt, it was like being weightless. And I actually had that experience a few times. It sort of repeated itself. And I always sort of dramatically tell the story as if it's true that I really flew up into the sky. And of course I didn't, but I really phenomenologically had that experience. And so that changed my sense of what was possible, right? That changed my sort of, like my sense of the level of effortlessness that I could actually go searching for changed. Like I often said in the beginning when I was doing this practice, I didn't know it was possible to feel this good, right? But then when I felt that good, then I knew it was possible, and that sort of changed what I was doing. I love, Daniel, this phrase, the sacred romance, and I think there's something about like when we act as if we know what's going on. I think that the fates are telling me this. I think this is what my dreams are telling me to do. I'm going to act as if it's true. Even if I discover to my horror that I made a terrible mistake and things are a lot worse right now, in that moment of doing it, I would say that's where I would use the word aliveness. Like that's an incredible, like I am just, I'm standing at the edge of the high dive, and I don't really know how to dive, and I might belly flop this, and I might wish I never did it. But when I'm at the edge of the high dive, and I'm a little kid and I do it for the first time, I mean, this is real aliveness. This is like testing the possibilities. And so even when it's sort of, I regret it later, well, even I get the opportunity to regret it and then weigh it up, and then maybe I belly flopped and like I'm in screaming pain for an hour, but then 3 hours later it's a funny story, and now I can sort of step back. Just last thing I wanted to say, so I can pass it. But it seems to me, so I think Sam mentioned finding everyone here. The reason I found everyone here is because I put a little comment on a video between John Vervaeke and Aspasia, and we connected, and then I connected through her to Daniel, and then to here, and then I went to Lynchburg, Virginia a couple weeks ago. So all of these things that happen. But I think what's going on with something like the net, and I also, one of your phrases, Daniel, that I understand better what you really mean by the social coordination mechanism. So what we're doing here, or what Daniel and Michelle have invited by just bringing in a bunch of people with all these backgrounds is, it's planned out, but what happens in this space is something akin to the music of John Cage that was based on chance. If anyone knows what I'm talking about, chance operations. Like if you don't know, John Cage was an experimental musician who he did all kinds of things, but one of the things he did is he would write scores of music with the I Ching. And he would just I'll let the I Ching decide what the next note is going to be. I'll let the I Ching decide how many beats of rest. And he would just create that, and then he sometimes it would be all scored out. So by the time it's like written out, it looks like a planned out score, but he didn't plan the plan. And then he would give it to the musicians, and then they would play. And of course, there were things that some people would question, say, is that really music? But then there were these moments of beauty that people would say, where did that come from? How did he think of this? Or and so I think when you just open a space like the net, in a way you're doing that. It's like, I know that there's a certain container, there's a certain amount of time, there's a certain invitation, but who knows what these people are going to say. But there's a kind of a faith ahead of time, right, that beauty will emerge from this. So yeah.
Magnificent. I think it's a fantastic description. There's a certain faith in the possibility of a resolution note based on what people say, because they are of the virtue and character and openness by which that is possible. Like, it's very interesting. You brought up that example of music with the resolution note. Perhaps the difference between destiny and fate is that destiny has a resolution note, where fate is more like it falls apart. It falls apart. It doesn't reach the resolution note. I'm thinking about that now. There is something about following the sacred romance that feels like going it feels like it arrives at a resolution note. There's a certain faith in the resolution note that is there. That seems very, very powerful. I will also note you were talking about with the sacred romance that you can do something and it goes wrong and you're like, why did I even do it? It's actually very interesting. I think there's a long tradition of the notion God tells you to do something and the first thing that happens is terrible. And it almost needs to be that way because otherwise you would be doing it for the practical results. It would have a rational reason. So the sacred romance almost seems to necessarily have to go through something where it's like testing you to see, are you doing it for the sake of the sacred romance as an end in itself, or simply for what it can get you? And actually, ultimately, it does seem as if the human only finds themselves when they are primarily in a mode of life that feels like an end in itself. And I would associate that with Sabbath. I would associate that with the presence of God. I would associate when you were talking about going through the factory floor, and there's a moment of posture and presence, radical presence. This seems to be where the idea of the end in itself is in the body, not just the mind. Because usually when we talk about we need to treat things as an end in itself, not a means, that's an intellectual notion. How do you feel it, though? Well, that would require your work, and then you feel it, right? And then if you can feel end in itselfness in your body, well, now you may be able to think it if thinking follows perception. The problem is, I think often people are trying to find the end in itself through thought, and they don't have the perception or the qualitative experience by which to even recognize the end in itself if they even found it. There's this great irony, I think, where we assume that if we encountered, I'll say the truth, that we would recognize it. That doesn't necessarily follow. You could encounter the truth and not have the eyes to see it, as Cossetto. That's a theme in our novel, To Turn the World. I think it is the case that if you don't train your perception, that actually you won't be able to recognize that of which is the thriving of the human being, even if you come upon it. There's an assumption that thinking will know it when it encounters it. I don't think that's necessarily true. And if you never have the experience in the body of the end in itselfness, then you can't recognize it, and therefore thinking is always going to miss it. Thinking doesn't know what it's thinking toward without those phenomenological experiences. And therefore, its likelihood of arrival at the thing it's thinking about as all important is very low indeed. And so for me, there's very much a long tradition in philosophy, especially ethics, of talking about ends in themselves versus means to ends in themselves. I don't think that phrase can be meaningful to us without feeling it in the body, or feeling it in a conversation like this of the flow state, or feeling it in where hours go by and you don't know where you go. When you have those flow states, when you have those conversations, the geopadic or that full presence in the body, now you've had the qualitative experience to know what it means to talk about the end in itself, or Sabbath, etc., so forth. If you never have those experiences, and instead you have thinking lead the way, then thinking will never know what it's thinking about, and it will and then it will never, I think, fully realize the sacred romance. And it was Herbie Hancock that would talk about Miles Davis in that way. He would play drums and he would miss notes on the piano, not drums, piano, and Miles Davis would jump all over it. And that was one of the things that Herbie Hancock was always amazed by with Mr. Davis. And I love, if you've never heard of the album River, which is, I believe, a Joni Mitchell tribute album that Herbie Hancock did. It is tremendous. And the song River is fantastic. But anyway, I love Herbie Hancock. I think also, and then I'll give it to Michael and Christian, and you guys are great. I think this question of how to interpret, I think there's a problem today of how do you interpret effort? Is the lack of effort a vice or a virtue? I think under our current paradigm, most people assume if you're not feeling effort, you're doing it wrong. You're supposed to be tired. You're supposed to be effort. Otherwise, you're doing it wrong. But what is being suggested is that actually the effortlessness is evidence of the correct conditionality, right? Well, how do we square this? Well, here's another example of a problem I don't think we can think if we collapse the beautiful into the good. Because the only way to think of the lack of effort in terms of good is lazy. You're not working. You're not doing good. You're not acting. But if you think of the beautiful is the still point of the sacred romance. And you're actually supposed to feel effortless in it, in fact, because the beauty has a life of its own, right? So we're not able to think Sabbath properly. We're not able to interpret effort properly, energy, without a concept of the beautiful or the flow or the things that we're discussing here. And therefore, the average person is left to interpret for themselves if the lack of effort is good or bad. And they only have the paradigm of what's good to do. And it's good to work because that's what your parents did and everyone else is doing it. Therefore, the lack of effort is immoral and a vice, right? So if we collapse the good into the beautiful, as Mr. Jonkin stresses and says so elegantly, then we cannot properly interpret the use of effort. And as a result, then we will work very hard to go nowhere. So I think that is a major problem. But let me give it to Michael and then Christian. Michael, please.
Yeah, there's so much here. I I want to go back like to feels like quite a while ago now to something Javier said where he was talking about how a lot of us think about what is consciousness, what is
Yeah.
awareness, all these things. But like we don't often stop and ask the question like what is it all for? And he was asking the question like why should we learn from our choices?
Mm,
Uh, like what is the point of actually reflecting on decisions that we make, the ripple effects that makes in the world? Um, I think there's like a moral, ethical component to that of like realizing, becoming more clear on things of right and wrong if we step back and say like okay like what was the effects of that, how could I maybe mitigate um harm in the future, kind of that conception. But I think even more fundamentally, I think by like understanding the effects of our actions and choices, I think we become more instantiated in our own agency. And I think we get clearer on, like, a thought I had like 5 minutes ago was like, what if all of our destinies are to realize our destiny in every moment?
oh,
Which
that's
sounds
nice.
kind of maybe odd or like
I like that.
confusing or something. Um, but I feel like destiny is something that it's attractive because it's possible, but also because it's like unknown to us. Um, and yeah, and um, I was also thinking about the phrase like because when Javier was talking about like reflecting on our choices, I was thinking about the phrase history is destined to repeat itself. And I was like, destined, like the word we've been talking about, the whole time, but it's used in a way that kind of it seems like more akin to what we're talking about with fate, where like fate is just something that is inevitable, right? And like and can't be like intercepted, can't be uh altered, can't be, like history's just destined, or is it doomed? Oh shoot. Is it doomed or destined? I can't remember now. But like I think that's what gives my life meaning is like to think that there is a destiny for me, but that I have to actually go and find it. And I can't calculate my way there. Like I'm having an experience right now with this where um 3 months ago I took this job that I felt like was like a calling, and it just felt right. I was going to be a preschool teacher in this outdoor school. I was really kind of in this place where I wanted to move more into what does nature connection mean? Like how can we structure our lives in a way that connects to nature. I want to be able to see what that's like for young kids as someone who like wants to have kids one day. Like, what does that environment do to young kids? And for a multitude of reasons that I won't get into, I decided to step away, mutually part ways on Friday. And what I thought was this resonant field that I was stepping into, um, unfortunately had a lot of things that got in the way of that. You know, supervisors and dynamic relational dynamics, you know, humans, um, the adults mainly. Like the kids were actually great. Um, and I feel like I kind of have egg on my face. Like I'm like, what did I do this for? Like I'm barely scraping by. You know, I have all this like financial anxiety now, and I feel like the answer to that question is still going to reveal itself, but I'm noticing I'm moving through it without this kind of like baggage of rumination of like, why did I do this? Like, what was this all for? I'm like, oh, this wasn't everything that I thought it would be, but also I was exposed to so much beauty, like these kids that can dream and imagine and learn how to garden and like learn like the appreciation they have for all the insects and organisms. It's like it's impactful to bear witness to that. And so I know like it's going to have and it's going to continue to have a positive impact on me. And now I get to be kind of thrust back into the mystery of like, what's the next thing? Um, and I think if you can always cultivate that stance, um, you'll be able to listen. What we've been talking about, you'll be able to listen for the call of the destiny and like to really feel it in the body, as opposed to try and calculate it out. Because I think so many people try and when they think of what my fate or what my destiny is, it's usually distilled into a career, um, or I, you know, like even my mom, well-meaning, she'll say like I feel like I've always been destined to be a mother, and she'll put that above anything else, which is a beautiful, and I don't discount that as like being part of it, but um, for me, it transcends titles or labels or career paths or it's something that outlives the person. Um, it's something. It goes back to something we talked about at the very beginning, which is like destiny. Um, it transcends the individual. It's not individualistic. It's like it's kind of it's this. It can make it different for each individual, but it's like part of a story. Um, but yeah, I'll pass it back. Thank you.
No, no.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you said a lot there that was very important. I'll give it to Christian and Seth, and if anyone has final things, I really appreciate y'all moving with the time change. It's very interesting because there seems to be something about destiny needs to be a result of apprehensions that are never categorized or named ahead of time. It makes me think of this hesitancy in theology to name God or to talk about seeing God and you get destroyed. There seems to be something about destiny that actually there's a danger and if you over-identify it, if you over-categorize it, that because then you don't have to, because now you can calculate, because, you know, we talk all the time about the difference between calculation and apprehension, thought and perception, et cetera, so forth. The moment you calculate, the once you name your destiny, well, now you can calculate it. Now you can make a plan. Now you know what to do. Here's the weird thing. Knowing what to do seems to threaten destiny, which most people would associate the complete opposite, that destiny is when you know what to do. The suggestion, and I think this is true to life, is actually to the degree you know what to do is actually to a degree you're in danger of losing destiny and actually changing it into more of a fate, actually kind of leading it into something that's going to collapse, which then the religious traditions would say that collapse actually will help you get back to the open destiny, because the kind of falling apart then is going to actually, because there's also something about the sacred romance that seems to take whatever occurs can be incorporated into the trajectory retrospectively. There's no doom. That is what's very interesting. Like you're right. There's doom, fate, and destiny. Many theologies, and I would think Plato as well, and I would get there's never doom. There's no doom. Now there can be bad choice, there can be inefficiency, there can be immorality, but there's no doom. There can be stupidity, there can be all of that, but doom is not on the table. Now, again, you may make a choice that postpones or is inefficient for 30 years, which will feel like doom, but 30 years is not forever, right? Like by the word doom, I mean doom, if it is a meaningful term, would be the necessity of the loss of destiny. Like it is now necessarily the case that destiny cannot be recovered, or doom is when it is necessarily the case that the sacred romance is gone. Like, one would, I mean, theological traditions may say that there's hell, meaning you die and the game is over, per se. Now we'd have to get into those differences, but in the notion of in this life, that there is never a event that necessarily closes off the possibility of glimmers and glimpses in sacred romance. That's always still afforded, however hard it might be. But destiny is primarily that which follows from a mode of apprehension, which of course makes sense because religions link destiny to faith. You have to have faith for destiny, not calculate. And that means you have to apprehend. And actually, I love this phrase, the rumination of thought, where you don't have that anxiety, you don't have that rumination of thought. That actually seems to be openness to destiny. That's actually precisely the sort of state where you move in faith and ergo courage to have the possibility of the apprehension. And I think that's very, very important. But it does seem to me that destiny is that of which is in jeopardy as soon as you name it. Because then it moves from apprehension to calculation. But then, of course, how do you train apprehension? And this gets into all of that fun stuff, body philosophy conversations like this, et cetera, so forth. The last thing I will say, and then I will give it to Christian and Seth, is you said our destiny seems to be to make every moment our destiny. Like our destiny seems to be to make every moment our destiny. Another way to perhaps think about this is we feel belonging to the degree that all of our contingent moments are experienced as necessities. We actually find because belonging and necessity have to go together. Because there's some sort of necessity in belonging, right? Because I'm belonging, there's a necessity here that supports me. There's a structure here that is there. So if you can come to have a mode of life where every single contingent moment is experienced as a necessity, well, then that seems to be the state in which the human is most attuned, most authentic, et cetera, so forth. But this creates a very weird paradox. How do you make a contingent moment feel like a necessity? This is where the concept of the sacred romance comes back. But before going into that, I will pass it to Christian and then Seth. Christian, please.
Yeah. Well, first I'll just say, Michael, I also had one of these what's next moments the other day. It wasn't 200. My boss and I had been talking about restructuring our working agreement for a while. But it looks like I'll no longer be copy editing and only doing writing for now on, which I don't have qualms with, but it stoked for maybe like 15 minutes some amount of financial anxiety. But then that pretty quickly got transmuted into a sense of potentiality and like, oh boy, like I now have an opportunity for something interesting and unexpected to happen. What's that going to be? And that felt really good. But yeah, I can relate. Yeah, and actually that morning, and maybe this like helped with that kind of framing. I had been thinking in bed that morning about keeping the mind light, and the metaphor that kind of came up for me as I was thinking about this was like a surfboard. The way a surfboard is it's buoyant, and that requires a certain kind of rigidity and boundary making, but also a lightness to it. And and what it provides then is an opportunity for the surfer to interact with the depth of the ocean in a way that grants them all of this ability to move in a very powerful way, um, to kind of find a unification with the forces of the ocean rather than to be whatever smashed by the waves, or to have to struggle so much to stay afloat. And what would it mean to keep the mind light, so to speak? Um, this kind of goes back to what I was saying before about having the model of the self incorporate that kind of non-material but still causal aspect of reality, um, which again you can call whatever you want, but it's this is also like a John Cage composition. Just unexpected silence. Yeah, I don't know. I guess this is, I just have to accept that to some extent, there's some ineffability here. I mean, I feel like it's good work to try to find what is effable, and kind of like hit up against that boundary, because you can learn some. There's a spaciousness they talk about in meditation and Buddhism, um, openness, uh, and so if we like restructure our model of the self to include something that is infinite, um, what then does it mean to like be an authentic self? What does it mean to be in accordance with one's destiny or anything like this that invokes this kind of individual or whatever, this distinct instance of consciousness? Well, I want to say it just has to come back to love, and for me, I and some of you might have heard me say this before. I look at the transcendentals, beauty, truth, and goodness, as the kind of our deepest loves in life. That's one order, kind of more concrete, by which we can talk about something like uh, unconditional love or the love of God. Um, and so in that sense, if we model ourselves to incorporate the infinite, uh, it it allows us to, I think, kind of do what you're talking about, Michael, which is to find our destiny in each moment. Um, because I don't think uh, uh, love is not something that exists in the future, and I don't think it's something that exists in the abstract. So it's not, in my opinion. Well, I'm just going to say this, and we can bicker about exactly what the words mean. But it's not really something that's found in telos, um, or purpose or something like this. Uh, unless you kind of put telos in the present moment, right? And this is right, like the destiny is in the present moment. If you put it there and not in the future, like my destiny is to become something out there one day, uh, then I guess you can say that love and purpose and telos are kind of bound up, can be bound up with each other in a certain sense. But that's not often how we use the idea of purpose or telos or destiny. Um, so we would be kind of creatively using our terms there, or very mystically using our terms there. But anyways, it's so we come back into the kind of infinite nowness, and we find a sense of self which It's not limited to our models, which is not limited to our temporal models of, you know, what's going to be, what's here, what's not there, and something that is, I don't want to say is like everything, but is more just like infinite, not finite, and that then, you know, then we can love, then we can be open to what is, which I think is kind of synonymous with love, is to Forrest Landry has that great quote, "Love is that which affords choice," I think is how it goes. And I don't think that captures everything that there is to love, but I think it maybe captures something important that I'm speaking to right now, which is that openness, which I think is love, and why you can talk about love as like an unconditional thing, is like what fuck it I don't know, maybe it's just too profane to even try to talk about these things. I feel like there's something that can be said about love here, uh, which you know, as you allow yourself to love more things, um, which maybe it's just this process of like a, of not needing to like separate things, right? To like kind of holistically accept what is going on as much as possible. That is a kind of unconditional loving of what is. That kind of in a feedback loopy way can help you be more in touch with the self as infinite. And that gives you greater choice, because now the kind of fundamental reference point of you in yourself and in your like world model is not bound up with your conceptualizations of you, right? Whereas if you do identify with the ego, now your sense of potentiality is like limited to memory and what you believe about yourself. And so you're kind of like necessarily less unconditionally loving life. You have less sense of possibility, less affordance of choice. Anyway,
Absolutely.
there's no good place to stop this kind of rant. You just have
No,
to
but
arbitrarily choose.
what you are saying is so important. Love, you cannot know that which you do not love. And you are what you love. So this is the feedback loop. James K.F. Smith talks about you are what you love. So what we love makes us who we are. And the only things we can know are what we love. So we are made by that of which we actually know. And love is also a temporal process. And absolutely true, good, and beautiful are dispositions of love. And you can't know the true if you don't love it. You can't know the good if you don't love it. And you can't know the beautiful if you don't love it. And then there's this traditional idea that true, good, and beautiful trains the love to love the next. And ultimately, it wants to love the beautiful because the beautiful contains the other three, right? That you have to move up the ladder of being, the analogy of being, of the true, the good, into the beautiful. And in that beauty, there is a definitiveness. So you are what you love. And that means you are that of which you actually know, because you can only know that which you love, because it is only in a mode of love by which things can come forth in terms of beauty. And beauty is also glimmers, glimpses, etc., so forth. Now, also, there's an interesting idea of the following. How do you love? You know, it's one thing to say that, you know, we need to love in order to know things, but can you just choose to love? Like, can you just choose to love? This is the odd thing. This gets to the destiny fate combo. Is not love something people talk about as you fall in love? You just start loving, you don't know where it comes from. Oh, well, this is a problem, because if the only way that we can know something is to love it, and we don't seem to have complete choice over what we love, then what do we do? Doesn't that mean we don't have choice over what we can fully know and thus be made in the image and likeness of? This is odd. Well, this is where the concept of the sacred romance seems to be really important. That seems to be part of reality itself, because I would argue that one's capacity to love is tied to the degree that they follow this sacred romance and to learn to be attuned to this operation that seems to be going on that thinking gets in the way of. But how do you follow the ineffable? Like, if ultimately there's some sort of following of the ineffable, having the ineffable be that which guides your life and thinking about it makes it go away, isn't that an impossibility? Well, it has to somehow be in the body. It has to somehow be a fuller way of choice that isn't just thought. And this gets into a lot of different things. But there is a theory that the ability to love is trained by the following of the sacred romance that cannot be reduced to a mere thought activity. It has to get more into apprehension than calculation. And to the degree you do that is to the degree that you actually gain the capacity to actually love more, which means you can know more, which means you can be made in the image and likeness of more, and thus have a fuller self. And then the problem is the authentic individual can actually threaten that if being an authentic individual is cut off from that ever feedback loop that is a possibility of a certain expansion of the being that one is, that is afforded by greater capacities of love that only come by following the sacred romance, which you cannot reduce to your choice, because you can't choose for the sacred romance to show up. It shows up. You can choose what you do when it shows up, and that seems to be what love is like. And without love, you can't know anything. And this seems to, the topic of love is getting right at the weird relationship between choice and destiny, choice and fate. All of these different things are wrapped up in love. And love is arguably the epistemology of the problem of fate and destiny, if you will, of the condition of fate and destiny. And how do we get better at loving? It seems to be tied to some sort of attunement to a sacred romance. But more must be said. And we have this issue of contingent moments as necessity. But let me give it to Seth.
Thank you, Daniel. Feel a lot of love with you sitting out there being bitten by mosquitoes. And I also really appreciated, Christian, all the time you spent swimming in the ineffable, trying to find the words. I mean, I think that was even a little just spontaneous demonstration of what we're talking about, because it seems like it was in your body, and yet, you know, the words is a different piece. I mean, Daniel, you referred earlier to our conversations that came out of the visit and the philosophy of glimpses, and the idea that, you know, perception and thinking don't happen at the same time, and there's a place in between. And one of the ways I always think of that is like, I invited people when I was sitting there in your office with you, said, how are you doing? And then I said, how do you find the words to answer that question? Well, you look at something that's wordless, right? You know, it might be so fast that we don't notice it, but I think when we slow down, sometimes we spend more time like we're looking at the thing, looking right at it, but I don't have the words. And then at the same time, something's unfolding, something's happening. The reason I just raised my hand again was this thing that started with Michael's question around the destiny of each moment. And then he was telling the story of this job he took that he thought was going to be great, and it wasn't so great, but he was able to say, well, you know, I had this experience with those kids that was really beautiful. So I mentioned earlier this idea of learning through mantra, and another recent mantra that comes from a friend of mine who's a huge fan of the work of Byron Katie. If anyone knows of Byron Katie, anyway, one of her things, just to tie her in, is she says intimacy is loving what is, right? And so my friend sort of, you know, I think really in an exemplary way lives her life like that. And it is this sort of decision ahead of time that I will love whatever is about to take place, whatever I'm about to experience. I will love this thing. But there is a practical question, like how, which Daniel asked, right? How do you do that? Because it's one thing to say, well, you know, like, look, Jesus did it, you know, but how many of us can act like that, you know? But she has a phrase that I have used as a little mantra, and I think I kind of heard it in Michael's story. And so you find yourself in the midst of the situation that, let's say, tempts you away from love, because all kinds of mayhem is taking place. I'm not sure if I like this. So her question, though, is, what is my attention for? Right? Because there's always like a billion different things I could put my attention on. But right now, what in this situation is for me? Like she'll often use the example of you have some family reunion, and you know that there's going to be all kinds of contentious, conversations about politics, or so-and-so's an alcoholic, and all of these things. But, if you accept the invitation to go to the reunion, then why would you go there and say, oh my God, the alcoholic, and oh my God, I can't believe they are. So what you need to do is, what you're there for. And, it could be as simple as, well, the food is going to be delicious. I'm there for the food, right? But it's like, what your attention is for. And then when the political discussion comes up and it just turns into a food fight, you're not there for that. And you just, however you handle that moment is however you handled it in the moment. But you knew ahead of time what you were there for, what your attention was for, as opposed to, what it's not for. And then that can be the feeling of, oh my God, I'm trapped here and I have to endure this terrible thing that I didn't want. That might be, anyway, I thought to bring that in because that might be like a in the moment kind of thing, in terms of how do we work with these. But, if I was someone like Michael Phelps, then my attention would be for getting better at swimming in every single moment. Like, how does this make me a better swimmer? But I think that's a really good question that we can hold out. What is my attention for? And just lastly, like on a personal note, the word attention in the work that I do is kind of a magical word. And so when I hang out the net, every time someone says the word attention and it's in a different and new context that I haven't thought of before, it's actually very encouraging and gives me a sense of life. Like, oh, like I think about attention all the time, but here's a new application of it. So it's just very nourishing to be here. Lots of appreciation for everyone. So.
Well, very nourishing that with you here, Seth, and appreciate very much. And thank you all. And that's hilarious, Christian. And thank you all for making the time to be here on this evening. I really, really appreciate it. I think that question, what is my attention for? That is a powerful way by which to posture and condition oneself when you go into a space. And it does seem to be, Adam is making the argument in his book, Still Life. I think his Substack is called Basecamp, and he talks about Simone Bay, who I adore. And then Illich is big on this, and obviously McGilchrist. There's a way in which the question of attention is an ethical act. What you attend is what you become like. It conditions the unfolding that is now possible. And if you don't choose, it's a very funny way in which we ask a lot about free will, which then gets you into cause and effect and billiard balls and different things. But the question of freedom is found in the attention, because the attention is the kind of conditioning of the materiality that is unfolding, like what is occurring in, right? So there's an interesting idea of attention as a kind of framing of what is, that has an impact on what can then unfold, right? Especially between people. It becomes obvious between people. And so to ask the question, what is my attention for, is this kind of act of framing freedom almost. It's freedom in the framing versus the action, of which then is almost like the gardener creating, or the architect creating the conditions of what then unfolds is different. And if you ask about the individual activities, oh, was that determinism or freedom? That's beside the point, because the entire environment that is afforded by attention is in of itself a testament to a certain sort of agency. But this is not the agency of an individual, but the agency of a kind of world architect, if you will, a relational architect, a space architect, seeing attention as space making. And I do think, I think in the net, in conversations, I mentioned the Jeff Society, there is a certain architecture of space making, of space, that is the cora, possible because of subjects and people that are coming together in a certain way. And I think that is very, very important. And yes, I think also it does seem as if attention is very, it looks like it may start raining, so we'll see if the computer survives. But you know, the last thing I'll say and then close for this wonderful evening is that one's ability to experience contingency is necessary, which seems to be where the human finds belonging. When you feel like your contingent moments are necessary, then you feel belonging, you feel fittedness. This seems to be tied to the question of attention, how you attend every moment, how you experience every moment, and it seems to be the training that affords this possibility. And I think it's tied to the sacred romance because it seems as if training attention is how you're able to follow or experience the sacred romance. And the sacred romance, by following, is that of which then in it you experience contingent moments as then necessities. And you actually come to realize, oh, I could have done different moments, and they would have, even though they were different, still been necessary because they would have still fallen under the umbrella of the sacred romance because there are options in the sacred romance. But all of the options in the sacred romance are actually equally necessary because they are now in the sacred romance that was followed. So you get this double move where we tend to think about necessity and contingency as opposites. But what if every possible experience contains the potential of being a necessity if aligned with the sacred romance? Well, then everything in its very contingency would have the ability of being experienced as necessary and therefore meaningful in this chosen sort of way. And that what actually following the sacred romance does, the sacred romance is the living life in a manner where you actually bring out the necessity and contingency. And actually, under the sacred romance, you can make whatever choices you want. And even if they go the wrong way, they can always be looped back. They can always be looped back into the sacred romance. And then once they're looped back, the contingency suddenly is experienced as necessary. And that looping back function creates this feeling of belonging and power and meaning. And that it is in the sacred romance that this possibility of the loop back, if you will, is actually the experience of the necessity of contingency that then feels like belonging. And that is afforded when you have attention. And then you experience your moments as present. Because this is the issue. If every moment contains a latent potential of necessity, then you don't have to think so much. You just have to be. Because whatever you are will be looped into the necessity of the sacred romance. And so you actually can be present. Thinking comes out of so much of feeling there's a wrong choice. You think because you can be wrong, right? But if every possible option can be looped back into the necessity of the sacred romance, you don't have to worry so much. You just have to do something. You can actually be present because you don't need to worry. So in the sacred romance, and I'm not saying every choice falls under the umbrella of the sacred romance, but it is interesting that every possible, it seems the idea of providence is that there is at any moment the possibility of the sacred romance reappearing, and even if you acted outside of it, then that too can actually now be weaved in. As long as you reply to the sacred romance at some point, it can always be looped back in. There's simply the choice of not replying to the sacred romance or replying to the sacred romance. If you reply to it, then all possible moments can be looped into it. If you do not reply to it, then you could have had a resolution note, but you will not in your experience, not because the potential was not latently there, but because you chose to act in such a manner that was on the side of fate versus destiny, that was on the side of not experiencing the resolution note. You were still in music. You just don't get to experience the resolution note. That's the difference. Every music could potentially not have a resolution note, right? And the experience of music without a resolution note is very different from music with a resolution note. Because every possible experience is music, then every possible experience could have a resolution note if rightly arranged, but also every possible experience doesn't have to have a resolution note, right? Because it doesn't. And the sacred romance and having the apprehension of that is precisely the ordering of every musical moment in a manner that realizes a resolution note and therefore feels like destiny versus music. And it has a loop back structure because the last note of the song loops back and changes the experience of the entire song. It is now it's harmonized, right? It is very funny if a song, it's just like a story. If you watch a TV show and the last episode sucks, it's really hard to have fond memories of the show, right? Even if you enjoyed it, it's colored over. The same goes with music. If the music doesn't have a resolution note or it doesn't end in a place that feels fitting, it is hard to think fondly back on the music, right? So it goes with shows. So it goes with life. It is very difficult to look back on the trajectory of life if there's not a resolution note and to actually experience it as good. But the hope is that actually it is not so much the problem of you made good choices or bad choices, because every choice could be music that is ordered into a resolution note. The question is, did you follow the sacred romance or not? Did you try? Were you looking for it? And at any moment, in any point of your life, you can make that choice today. To choose life, to make all things new. And therefore, there is no doom, because there can always be a resolution note. The question is, do you follow the sacred romance or not? And if you do, then reality has the loop back structure. And the loop back structure, yes, the net is there's supposed to be the experience of the loop back structure, because I think that is actually the mode of being that affords the possibility of the structure to be more musical and have faith in the resolution note. You don't know where it's going to go, but then it feels like it's all necessary, right? You don't know where the conversation's going to go, but it's the kind of people that are open to where it goes, and therefore there's the possibility of the resolution note. That sort of conversation can then train and habituate subjectivity to have that same mode for life itself, because life itself actually can do that if one is simply committed to the possibility of the resolution note, the following of the sacred romance, which in a conversation is the act of listening to one another and trying to meet them. But one of the main reasons people can't do that is because they don't have control of their body. They feel anxiety in a conversation. They don't know what's going on, so they break it, right? They don't have the training in perception, in emotion, in themselves to actually hold the container. Well, that applies to conversation. That applies to life. And if you don't have that training in the body, then you can't hold out for the resolution note that retrospectively reaches back and makes it all music. And it has certainly been fun this evening to be part of the music with y'all. So thank you for making the time. It has been a treat. Thank you all. All the best.